very early on, I realized in my own body, before I had read anything really much about fascia, I had an innate understanding of what it was. And when I first started practicing, it was amazing to see how the general population couldn't do the things I thought they could do. And it became very clear very quickly that unless you change the fascia, it was much harder to change movement patterns. So over these last 15 years, I've developed a fascia release technique of my own. The body flossing I'd started many years before even to get myself out of pain. I've developed a self-care paradigms for various clients. And so today we're going to look at some techniques and some case histories and go over some of the methods. A lot of people don't think you can actually train hypermobile people. It's a very different kind of training than someone who isn't hypermobile, but it can be done. I've been doing it. So I've been trying to cull out of all the vast information out there, what are the primary considerations and some of the confusions that happen. One of them is understanding biotensegrity and force transmission. This is key to understanding the training of a hypermobile client, patient, because often if you're training people in misalignment or in crooked, you're actually strengthening the misalignment. And that's because the force transmissions have been altered as the body changes shape and becomes contorted. So on the left here, you have Buckminster Fuller, who came up with the term tensegrity. He's an architect and a futurist. And on the right, you have my holographic image of the biotensegrity of the body. That's an illustration that I've made. And you can see that figure, yeah, on the right. So Buckminster Fuller and all of his ideas about movement and architecture, the geodesic domes that we see in those models that collapse and fold, usually they're made out of sticks and string, and they don't offer the best three-dimensional, in some ways four-dimensional view of biotensegrity. But in the research, it tells us that fibroblasts create more collagen to meet the need of force transmission, and often the lines in fascia are representative of various lines of force transmission in the body. So you can see in the shaded image behind here, it's a spider web, but that's what gives us our symphonic movement, our ability to bend and create balance. So what happens with the hypermobile, and you all know this, is that oftentimes their major joints don't create the stable skeleton, the scaffold that we need. And each major joint is an access point for movement, is an anchor in a sense, but they don't have their anchors. So, and often their anchors they're tight deep to the bone. One of the first things I notice about them is you have to go deep to get to their dominant patterns. And those dominant patterns are sometimes difficult to understand, but you can recreate stability by reestablishing what I'll later call cardinal alignments at the joints. Sometimes people don't, I mean, I've been explaining fascia to clients and various other people who've come into the studio over the years. And what's hard to understand is we understand quite well that scoliosis can affect the viscera, can affect ligaments, joints, tendons, venous supply, lymphatic function due to pressures and force transmission. The same thing actually happens with fascia, especially in the hypermobile client. So in the illustration on the left, I've tried to illustrate some of the internal pressures just from anterior tilt, forward neck, and forward shoulder. And the red line kind of imparts where there's undue force transmission that's been altered and it's out of balance. So some of the other lines from the figure on the left have disappeared because the dominant lines are what's happening. And in this particular one, and I think it could be relative to POTS. I know POTS is very complicated, and I've seen this relieved in case histories. You open up that chest and you take a lot of pressure off the heart and lungs and the throat. So there's a lot of pressure, downward pressure. Fascia, when it's healthy, will spiral us up. when it's not healthy, and typically you see this in a lot of the Ehlers-Danlos clientele patients, they're spiraling down, they're collapsing. And what's collapsing is the internal arches of the body that are formed by fascia. So inherently, even if you've never taken a class in physics, we also understand that the arches we walk under are not going to fall on top of us. There's no center column. Arches are created by this force of the dome or of the arch that are created to keep that top stone from falling on you. Same thing happens in the body. The literature tells us that fascia is quite significant in forming the shape of the body. And when you actually start looking at the anatomy, you'll start seeing internal organs that are spheres or domed, cavities are domed, parts of the heart are domed, our eyes, our skull, our thoracic cage. We're full of arches and domes and spheres that are natural in nature. They're organic, so they're different than a structural one in architecture, but they still must be maintained to avoid that compression on every part of the internal body. So you might already know this, but sometimes I see people don't quite get the 3-dimensional or even 4-dimensional aspect of fascia moving in the body, because we don't just move, we move over space and time. So in a sense, you want to consider the body in 4 dimensions because it changes as it moves. I often videotape people walking because it tells me a lot more about what's working with what and what isn't. So nothing in the body touches anything else except via a fascial extension, a wrap, a sling, a canopy. It's all wrapped. So one of the other concepts that has come up over the years for me, and all of these, most of the images you see online are of anatomically correct positioning. I'm working on illustrating misalignments, and there's a few in here, but the fascia is actually woven. And in this particular piece, this is from Carla Stecco's fascial anatomy book that came out about 6-7 years ago. She talks about the angles of the threads of fascia and how they're layered. And what that does is it creates incredible strength. We know that if we take a reed, it's limp, doesn't hold any weight. But if you weave a couple hundred reeds together, you get a basket that will carry water and hold a lot of weight. So we are woven on layers upon layers in different direction. So when the fascia is healthy, when it's not scarred, adhered, densified, rigidified, it helps everything flow and it protects the viscera. So often these are healthy, they look healthy, they're also cadavers. So a lot of biomechanical pathology disappears in the non-living body. But we are woven strong, and that is another attribute when it comes to misaligned or tight or rigid fascia that's collapsing. It doesn't work as well in strength because the weave is distorted. The center image, I've actually literally deliberately removed the references that she has in the book to muscles and tendons and so forth, because our movement is symphonic, and the fascia that envelopes everything, wraps everything, is the conductor of motion, just as a conductor guides musical notes as musicians. So I prefer, when I'm looking at the body, when I'm working on the body, to think of it as a whole organic piece. And this is a posterior right shoulder here in the center. The dark red obviously is muscle, but it has a wholeness to its structure. It has some component parts, but they're more attached like a fabric, a garment, than they are like a machine. And they work more fluidly like a tough living leather than they do a machine. So one of my concepts is to get rid of the machine and the CPU metaphor and start thinking more as a whole unit. The image on the right is the thoracolumbar fascia, also from Stecco's book. And again, it looks like a fabric, like you've changed the color of wool when you're knitting. It's made into a sheath. And the thoracolumbar fascia becomes pretty important many Hypermobile EDS clients have internally rotated femurs, generally an anteriorly tilted pelvis, occasionally a posterior tilted pelvis. And their thoracolumbar fascia, I call it the grand central station. It dominates force transmission, particularly in the posterior part of the body. And once it's congested or the form has changed, the alignments have changed, it's going to dictate up and down the chain, up and down the what I call the tight suit inside. There it is, the tight suit inside. So these are some of my favorite images. On the left is Carla Stecco's upper extremity, shoulder, rib cage, sternum. And if you look closely, the fascia that connects at the xiphoid process, it looks like unfinished fiberglass. It looks tough and strong as hell. So she's showing you she's showing the fascia that overlies all the organs and muscles here. Interesting though, compare that to Julian Baker's thoracic anatomy picture here, and look at that web, that spider web fascia that goes through the intercostal muscles. What comes to mind with this is a particular case history, and I'll note it in a little bit. The internally rotated femur conjoins with all the very tough, thick structural fascia of the pelvis and hip and thoracolumbar fascia. It can serve, when it's misaligned, to lock the upper extremity fascia. So I had a client, and I'll bring up pictures of her in a minute, who had costochondritis, gastroparesis, lupus, celiac, lots of comorbidities. We got her costochondritis and her gastroparesis to go away when we realigned her pelvis and her femur, and we accidentally released her deep front line unknowingly. It was pretty dramatic, but very exciting. Changed a lot for her. So again, you can see there's a superficial layer of fascia that are relatively super, it might be an epimismal or the perimismal, but then you go deeper and there's woven fascia that goes through the structure. So again, you have to, for me in my work, I try to think of the whole body moving as a unit and then developing differentiation according to movements and joints. The right picture you probably have seen. It just shows how the fascia works more like Velcro. It becomes woven again between its layers, between the layers of whatever it's separating. It looks more like Velcro extensions. So again, it's very, very strong. Like Velcro is really incredibly strong because it has so many connections. So we have to take those forces into account when we're trying to change the dysfunction of the hypermobile body. So this is a set of drawings or illustrations I did a year or two ago to show how this is what I call the functional shoulder. And for me, when I do release or training, I'm looking at how the shoulder attaches to the hip because they don't act separately. They're always coordinated. So the first image up there on the left is the right upper extremity. The shoulder connects to the sternum, to the neck, through via sternocleidomastoid, to the head, cranium, down to the hip, and eventually beyond. So, and then the next one to it is the posterior right shoulder. And these are points of that I release when I do fascia release. They're areas of congestion that I consider when I'm choosing which exercises to do. So the one on the far right, I think, I can't see it because the screen is there, is the side of the arm, including the deltoid. And then of course, the bottom one is the pectoral girdle and the axilla, top of the arm, deltoid. But you can see it gets very complex around certain joints. So what I've been saying is you can't just work at a joint because of biotensegrity. You have to understand that complete, full, complex relationship. These are illustrations of aligned bodies. Again, they're not of the misaligned. I haven't finished all my illustrations on the misaligned body, but there's a few in here. I refer to the fascia as the tight suit inside, which is how I experienced it for 30 years myself. So this is a demonstration here, forces and patterns in the hypermobile body. So this is simply an illustration of what an internally rotated, slightly hiked shoulder can do. So on the left, you have the image of the person. She too has internal rotation of the femurs. I didn't fully illustrate that, but on the shoulder there, I've illustrated the lines of compression that come across from the neck down to the deltoid and into the arm, as well as the pectoral girdle. What they represent is force transmissions that, because of misalignment, have been diverted and add extra compression and force through the tissue, because the misalignment will change how forces are balanced through the tissue when we move or lift or load. So the hypermobile body collapses, it gets torsion, it's compressed, it has rotations that are sometimes permanent or seem stuck, and they generally have a lot of fascial dysfunction and pain. The above person has the classic internally rotated femur. She's actually one of the case histories that'll come up in a minute. So you can go through the body and you're going to see force transmissions displaced in almost every hypermobile body that I've ever seen. So a few case histories. BH is a very funny woman. She's a stand-up comic. She came to the studio, a friend of my daughter. She was 22 at the time. She had been told she had hypermobility by someone, a PT, but they just said, be careful. She's like, what does that mean? I'm like, well, let's find out. So she had sprained her ankle, and typically, she said she had a lot of sprained ankles. Typically, she'd be in bed for a week or two, very slow recovery time. A few sessions into the work, she revealed that she had vagissimus and she was not able to have sex or use tampons at all. That had quite a few effects on her. So the one illustration, I was trying to figure out the torsions, and the pelvis, of course, and the female pelvis fascially is very complicated. But I did find a program that would do the twisting for me, so that the rotating femurs, the same hip muscles that attach to the ilium on the outside, all the abdominals and pelvic floor muscles attached to the same bone. So when the hips are out, they're pulling on the ilium, and they will distort and create pressures on the pelvic floor. Once we corrected her posterior tilt and her internally rotated femurs and got her feet, her arches to lift up again, she did quite well. And in fact, the bottom, she actually, and we're going to talk about this later, she stayed here. She was going to move to Chicago. She stayed for an extra year. She worked at the studio and trade, did the admin for a year. And so she got treatment and exercise and so forth 4 days a week for a year. That's her on the bottom. She's EDS, and she just told me recently she might be developing POTS. I haven't worked with her for 5 or 6 years now, but there she is doing the teaser, which is an incredibly difficult exercise in Pilates. And she's doing it on a soft balance beam, which means I use soft balance beams. I use soft things. I use various forms of destabilization to inspire the internal deep stabilizers. So there she is doing a teaser, which required her to use a core. A lot of EDS clients don't have good core. It requires her to have an elongated axial skeleton and control over her shoulders. So that was at the end of that year. She was able to do quite a bit. And then she did move to Chicago, and she was able to maintain through an occasional physical therapy and regular Pilates classes. But we did rebuild her structure. Carolyn is very interesting. So CH, she was, I think, 67, a real estate agent. She lives not here. She lives in the Northwest. Another client here had referred her to me. She was in one of the most complete full collapses I'd ever seen biomechanically. The picture that shows here is after a week of treatment. I lost a hard drive to a fall, so I don't have all of her pictures, but she was in near full collapse. I just read her MRI reports that she brought Her knee was a mess. They were recommending a knee replacement. Super hypermobile. I don't think she was ever diagnosed. I would say she's probably EDS for sure. She had all of these problems that are illustrated on the side here. A tilted pelvis, shearing at the pubic symphysis, rotation of the femurs, flattened feet, slightly externally rotated lower legs, forward shoulders, no core. She had no core in the beginning. And it's very difficult to train the core if the pelvis is tilted, for the shared wall concept, I call it. Muscles are strong enough to pull the bone away so that the muscles that attach on their side have a hard time or a harder time contracting. Now, this will come up later. Since you did live out of town, many years ago, I did residential immersions on my property. I had a guest house and a studio that were separate. So I used to do residential immersions anywhere from 3 days to 3 weeks long, where people would come. I recommended they never leave. We had gardens and chickens and herbs and fruit. And so they just stayed. And that's where I learned a lot of my techniques and some of the variable things. When you're working with clients 2 or 3 times a day, you get to know them really well. She did, and we'll come back to this later. She was one of the more successful of all the hypermobility clients, and I'll talk a little bit more in detail about why. She did 3 week-long immersions during the spring of 2016 or 17, I think. She's actually now traveling the world. I saw this on Facebook. She's on a catamaran in the Atlantic Ocean. She's taking 3 months with her whole family to cross the ocean. So she's doing pretty well. And apparently she never had the knee surgery. I haven't confirmed that yet. So Cece is a local client. She's a dear. She did not know about hypermobility until I told her she was hypermobile. Eventually, she did get diagnosed by Dr. Lukaitis several years later. When she first came, she was 26. She'd come because we got people out of pain. She did a lot of body flossing. She still does. And she works as a teacher with small children. She had chronic pain, brain fog, fatigue, often was sick, missing a lot of work. She developed POTS last year, had her gallbladder removed. However, the illustrations here, she says she came 4 days a week intermittently over 2 years. But I used to have a staff that I had trained, and I was developing an entire program of essential classes for hypermobile population to make getting the work cheaper. So the bottom are pictures were pre-pandemic, I think in the fall of 2019. And you can see her posture is pretty darn good. When she first came in, her shoulders were up to her ears. She had terrible calluses on the bottom of her feet. Her skin is a certain kind of reactive that it develops calluses. And you can see from those dot drawings on the top, there was the spring of 19 and then the fall of 19, she looked really good. And then there's summer and then there was the pandemic. So she changes shape. So part of what those illustrations are showing is the shape change and some of the vectors changing in alignment. She's actually doing quite well. She's actually going to be leaving town and going to graduate school. So she's been able, with body flossing, to maintain a better homeostasis. She gets occasional training. She's been doing really well. Okay, so this is one of my favorite case histories. This was the one I talked about earlier. She had gastroparesis, costochondritis, lupus, celiac disease, pain, inflammation, was on a whole lot of medications. So when I talk about how I look at the body, I mentioned that I didn't add video here because I wasn't secure about adding video, but plus I don't know how to de-identify people when they're walking in a video. So if you look at her on the left image, you want to look at the landscape of her contours. So I took on the right, I did this little dot thing that I do, and you can then see better how the right femur is much higher than the left. And she's on a flat surface. I have a bar under her knees to lengthen the femurs in a balanced way. So when I actually take away the dots and get rid of the photo image, you can see how contorted she is. Her right ribs are higher than her left, and they're shaped differently. Often, as you well know, probably, a lot of EDS clients are quite compacted, and there's lots of kinds of hypermobility. But there's a point of torsion there, and it's an internal torsion. It's part of being able to sort of have X-ray vision and see through the body. So that torsion, that point of torsion is right under her stomach where her gastroparesis is. Actually, in this image, her left leg is not as internally rotated. I mean, it is, but it's not as internally rotated as when she walks. You can see her center line there. And so that point of torsion also speaks as you go through the body's depth to the thoracolumbar fascia, which can lock the tilt of the pelvis. So often what I think is the femurs internally rotate. That causes often an anterior tilt of the pelvis, which will tighten up the thoracolumbar fascia and compress the lumbar spine. She worked at the studio for quite a while, about a year. One of her early sessions with me, she called me up to try to cancel. Now, this is really interesting because I saw research on it. She's severely celiac. So she said, I can't come in today. I accidentally ingested weed at a food truck. I'm going to be sick. I said, well, come on in. Let's just see what we can do. So I did what I think of as my classic full body tight suit release on her. She felt okay, better. She texted me a couple hours later and said, I'm gardening. I'm like, oh, that's nice. She's like, no, you don't understand. I'm normally in bed for 2 weeks after ingesting gluten. So this has come up in other case histories. When I think it's the full suit, you're opening up the full hydration system, the full immune system, because another client told me after a session, she went to her thermographer and the thermographer says, wow, all your inflammation, where'd it go? So there's something in that I don't have the science tools to research and document, but I've seen results. She didn't have her high inflammatory response that she normally had for decades. And okay, one last thing about her, she's really interesting. So she's older, yeah? She's been hypermobile. Usually I have clients bring in childhood pictures to see if I can see when their misalignment started and how entrenched they are. Not that they're not, in one way, they're not entrenched because they're hypermobile, but another way, because they get tight deeply, they can be deeply entrenched in dysfunctional patterns. So she'd been working at the studio probably 8 or 9 months, kind of seeing me. She would see me once a week, and then the other junior trainers, and then coming to the hypermobile classes I developed. One day I just said, dang it, that left leg's killing me. Her left leg would just not give up the ghost in terms of the rotation. So what we did was I cupped the fascial dysfunction pattern. Then I did an OOV pelvic tilt release correction. Then we did some Pilates rehab movements, and then I put her on the barrel step, had her internally rotate her femurs and hang her heels off the step. And then I'd never done it before. I'm not sure I've done it since. I had her rotate her knees internally and externally, and all of a sudden she started breathing deep gasps. And I was about to dial 911. I didn't know it was happening. She's like, no, I feel great. I'm like, you're scaring me. So for like 45 minutes, her lungs filled up. And she will tell you that she doesn't remember ever breathing that deeply in her whole life. After that, her costochondritis pain was gone. So I'm pretty sure we inadvertently released her deep front line because we changed the rotation of the left femur. It was very dramatic. And there's a lot, we could study that a lot. That would be so fun to research, to figure out the visceral aspects. But she was breathing, and she told me 2 weeks ago she hasn't had any chest pain since then. So along the way, a lot of what I'm talking about here today comes after 15 years of trial and error or accidents, things that happen that I didn't know would happen. So the right tools, myofascial release based on emerging research. My preference is to release the whole superficial suit. And I've been told I do it a little deeply. The figure on the right shows a lot of the common posterior force transmission lines that I release when I do release work. Body flossing, it's not, what I've realized in the last year teaching this online is that it's not like a lot of other self-myofascial release techniques, which those companies are selling products as well. So they have a line of products and they teach you how to use them. I was doing this stuff before there were tools. I was rubbing out on furniture and edges of bathtubs and tennis balls and whatever. So over 20 years, I mean, I started this on myself to get out of pain because many years ago in Manhattan, I was in a lot of pain for many years. A masseuse leaned over and said, Arlene, you can do this yourself. And I just started rubbing out myself. So I think what I've gleaned over the last year or two is that what I do is a more corrective form of fascial release. It's worked very well for a lot of my clients, particularly the hypermobile, because they can control a lot of their pain on a daily basis, which they need to do. One of the other aspects of training, and this is MB again, the woman who had the breathing incident and the celiac. This was like 6-8 months ago. I don't know. I asked her to sit down and sit up straight, and that's how she did on the left. Hypermobile bodies don't always know where they are in space. And then this was so funny. I often take pictures. So I just took a picture without her knowing it. And then I cued her to sit up straight. So if you start a program, initially they need a lot of training with an acute eye, to help change their habituated patterns. She's an academic, so she sits down a lot. I bet she sits just like that on the left a lot. They also, one of the other tools I like to use, and some of these are quite old, some of these are like 12, 13 years old, but jigs and rigs to create alignment in the training. So if you can align the body so the muscles are in a better alignment with props or jigs and rigs, you can improve proprioception and the training can be sometimes more effective. So this is way back 2010 or 9 on the left there with the resistance band. I used to do a lot of wrapping with resistance band long before the body braid came out. The top picture is about creating shape in the feet so that as we exercise, the muscles are working in better alignment. Same thing on the bottom one, that is BH, the stand-up comic. So placing balls or rigs or straps to align the body while it's moving its musculature, it will be better trained in alignment. All of this for me has always been after fascial release and body flossing. I also use stabilization and destabilization techniques. Sometimes you can't do that right away with the hypermobile. I had a 16-year-old boy once almost fall off those discs. He was crazy. But so as you can see, I had a disc there and I put a squishy ball under the sacrum. And then I put lines on the disc so I could watch even minute movements as they went through their hip and knee extension on the reformer to see at what point they were losing the movement. And the discs are very handy for training. They can correct arches. They can, in this case, I have BH with a ball at her knees to prevent her from internally rotating as she goes up and down on the discs to reestablish lower extremity function. So over the years, I've mentioned a couple of things here about different strategies. Some people have come in 4 days a week. That's how I trained myself. I did 4 days a week. I'm not hypermobile, but I did a 4-day-a-week accidental immersion many years ago, and that's how I got into shape and out of pain. I was also doing body flossing and traction. But in terms of my practice over the years, the most effective and practical strategy has been so far with Carolyn, CH, the woman who's now sailing the world. She came down for those 3-week-long immersions. So you need to interrupt the habituation. What I realize is that people go home, once they leave the studio, everything, all the consciousness about the work and the body goes away and they do their habits. They sit the same way, they eat the same way, they walk the same way, they watch TV the same way. The immersion creates an atmosphere over a period of time where they can't even stop thinking about the body work, the new body work they're learning. And this is a sample. I actually just found one of her immersions. I wrote a whole database years ago so I could price these things more easily and plan them. So this was her 6 days. She got a consultation and then basically initial training with me and a steam with cupping, as I recall. And then I had several trainers working for me. These two are actually my daughters who used to work for me. So the sessions were 3 times a week. I mean, 3 times a day. Every day there was taping, there was cupping, there was training. So there were breaks in between. The kind of training that this requires is not exhausting, and it's better to train the neuromuscular system immersively to avoid regression into old habits. So that's an example, and hers was quite successful because she didn't go back home. So in summary, intervention, as you guys all know, you intervene with EDS populations all the time, but from a biomechanical, biotensegral point of view, they all need that if they can tolerate it. So far, the best practical intervention has been the week-long immersions. If you do several of those over a period of time, you're more likely to change and remember the change and get your body to remember it. The mind must work. I once tried to work with a fellow with Alzheimer's or dementia. I mean, if you turned around, he wouldn't remember who you were. I got him out of pain after 50 years. He stood up and said, wow, that feels great. Then he turned around and he said, who are you? So you do actually have to have someone who can remember what's happening, mind to body. And all the clients that have followed the training have done well. Even the ones who haven't have had definite improvements. So I want to invite you all to spiral up instead of spiraling down, like what most people do, especially hypermobile. These are 2 anatomically beautiful specimens, and you can almost feel that it's spiraling up. Thank you very much.